"We don't need you anymore, Tige." That was the last thing my mother said to me before she hung up, her voice calm, almost relieved, like she had just set something down she had been carrying for too long, and I remember standing there with the phone still against my ear, listening to the silence after the call ended, because in our family silence was never empty, it was always an answer, and that day it was final. My name is Tige Monroe, and I learned early that not all rejection is loud, sometimes it comes wrapped in politeness, in measured words, in a tone that never rises but still manages to close a door you didn't realize you were standing in. I did not argue. I never argued. I said, "I understand, Mom," the way I had been trained to respond, respectful, composed, careful not to sound like I was asking for something I wasn't entitled to, and then I lowered the phone slowly, because rushing would have made it feel like panic, and panic was something I stopped allowing myself a long time ago. There are moments people expect to remember clearly, dramatic moments, loud ones, but what stayed with me wasn't the sentence itself, it was the way the kitchen looked when she said it, the afternoon light coming through the blinds, cutting the room into narrow lines, the clock ticking louder than usual, the chair across from me empty like it had always been, like it had been waiting for me to notice it. I had spent years sitting at tables where my presence was optional, where conversations continued whether I spoke or not, where my absence would have been easier than my effort to belong, and after a while, you stop trying to interrupt a story that was never written for you. My father didn't say anything that day. He rarely did. His silence was consistent, dependable in a way words never were, and I used to think consistency meant stability until I realized it could also mean absence, stretched out over time until it becomes normal. "She'll be fine," he said once, not to me, but about me, as if I were a situation, not a person, something that could resolve itself if left alone long enough, and that sentence stayed with me longer than anything else because it explained everything without needing to explain anything at all. I was fine. I became fine. That was the role I was given, and I played it well. I showed up when I was expected, I left when I was not, I learned to read rooms that never looked directly at me, and I adjusted myself until I fit into spaces that were never meant to hold me. Years passed like that, quietly, without announcement, without conflict, just a steady accumulation of moments that didn't include me, and I stopped measuring time by birthdays or holidays and started measuring it by absence, by how long it had been since my name was spoken in a room I used to belong to. 29 years is a long time to be an afterthought, but it is also long enough to learn how to build something without needing permission, long enough to understand that being overlooked can teach you more about people than being seen ever could. I did not disappear. I simply stepped out of reach. And when you step out of reach long enough, something interesting happens, people stop assuming you will be there when they turn back around. That is, until they need you. Because eventually, they always do. And when that day comes, when the silence breaks, when the same voice that once closed the door calls your name again, softer this time, careful, uncertain, that is when the story changes, not for them, but for you, because you are no longer standing in the same place you were when they left you there. And the difference between who you were and who you became is not something they can see, not yet, but they will. They always do. I learned to measure distance without moving. Not miles, not cities, but the space between a name spoken and a name forgotten. In our house, that distance was small at first, almost invisible, the kind you only notice when something slips through it. "Tige, can you clear the table?" my mother would say, her voice polite, controlled, always polite, and I would nod and say, "Of course, Mom," because that was the rhythm we kept, request and response, action and silence, a system that worked as long as no one asked why I was always the one standing while everyone else sat. My father would be at the head of the table. Not looking at me, not avoiding me either, just existing in a way that did not require acknowledgement, and I used to think that was neutrality until I realized neutrality, repeated often enough, becomes a choice. "Your sister has a big week," my mother would add sometimes, adjusting a napkin, smoothing a surface that did not need smoothing, "Let us make things easier for her," and I would say, "Yes, Mom," even when no one had asked what my week looked like, because offering that information would have sounded like an interruption, and interruptions were not something I allowed myself to be. It was not one moment. It never is. It was a pattern, small decisions stacked carefully until they formed something solid enough to stand on, or in my case, something solid enough to be left out of. Birthdays came and went with the same quiet efficiency, a cake for her, candles, photos, laughter that filled the room, and then, when my turn came months later, a dinner reservation, a polite happy birthday, a check paid without ceremony, as if celebration had a limit and I had arrived after it was already spent. I remember one year in particular, sitting at a restaurant with low lighting and heavy menus, my mother across from me, my father beside her, both of them discussing plans for the weekend, plans that did not include me, and I waited for the pause, the moment when someone might say, "What would you like to do, Tige?" But the pause never came, so I smiled and said, "This is lovely, thank you," because gratitude was easier than absence, and absence was something I had learned to carry without making it visible. At school, I learned a different language, one where effort had results, where questions had answers, where someone looked up when you spoke, and I stayed there longer than necessary, sitting in libraries, in classrooms, in places where my presence was registered, where a name on a paper meant something, and when I came home, I adjusted again, quieter, smaller, careful not to bring that version of myself into a space that had no use for it. "You are very independent," my mother said once, almost approving, as if independence had been a goal I chose instead of a condition I adapted to, and I nodded. I tried to be, because correcting her would have required a conversation we were not equipped to have. My father glanced up briefly then, just long enough to say, "That is good," before returning to whatever held his attention more consistently than I ever had, and that was the closest thing to recognition I received that year. Over time, I stopped waiting for different outcomes from the same inputs. I stopped setting expectations that had nowhere to land. I learned to listen differently, not to what they said, but to what they repeated. "She will be fine. She does not need much. Tige is easy." Easy became the word they used to describe me, and it sounded like a compliment until I understood it meant I required less attention, less effort, less presence, and once a person is defined that way, the system adjusts around it. You do not check on what you believe is already handled. You do not invest in what appears to run on its own. And I did run on my own. I made my own plans, built my own routines, created a life that did not depend on being invited, and from the outside, it looked seamless, like I had chosen distance when in reality I had simply stopped reaching for something that never reached back. There was a night, years later, when I stood in the hallway outside the living room and listened to them talk about me as if I were not there. "She is doing well," my mother said, her tone measured, satisfied. "We do not have to worry about Tige," and my father responded with a quiet, "That is how it should be," and I remember thinking, not with anger, not even with sadness, but with clarity, that they had built a version of me that required nothing from them, and they believed it. I stepped back then, quietly, the way I had learned to do everything, and I realized something I had not allowed myself to see before. They were not ignoring me by accident. They were relying on it. And once you understand that, once you see the structure for what it is, you stop trying to change it. You step outside of it. And you let it stand on its own until the day it cannot anymore. I did not leave. All at once. I reduced. Slowly. Carefully. The way you lower a volume until you are no longer sure if the sound is gone or if you have just learned to live without it. Calls became shorter first. "Hi Mom, I just wanted to check in." A pause. A polite response. "Everything is fine here, Tige. We are busy this week." I would say, "Of course, I understand," and I did. I always understood. That was the problem. Then the calls became less frequent. Not because I was waiting for them to reach out, but because I was observing something I had ignored for too long. Patterns. Timing. The absence of reciprocity. I began to notice that every conversation had a purpose, and that purpose was never me. It was updates about someone else. Requests for small favors. Information that needed to be delivered, not exchanged. I was not part of the conversation. I was a function inside it. "Tige, can you send me that document you mentioned last time?" Tige, can you look over this for your sister? Always polite. Always measured. Always assuming I would say yes. And I did. For a while. Because saying no would have required a discussion, and discussions implied a relationship we had never actually built. There was a day when my mother called and asked, "Are you free this weekend?" It was the first time in years she had asked me about my availability without attaching a task to it, and for a moment, I allowed myself to think something had shifted. "I can make time," I said, keeping my voice even, careful not to sound too eager. "Good," she replied, "your sister is moving apartments and we could use an extra set of hands." I stood there in my office, looking at the window, watching people cross the street below, each one heading somewhere that required them, and I felt something settle into place inside me, not disappointment, not even surprise, just recognition. "Of course," I said. "I will be there." That weekend, I carried boxes up 3 flights of stairs in a building that smelled like fresh paint and impatience, while my sister directed where things should go without ever once asking how I had been, and my mother stood in the doorway organizing details that did not include me, and my father arrived late, nodded once in my direction, and said, "Good to see you, Tige," like we had run into each other by accident. I did the work. Quietly. Efficiently. The way I always had. At one point, my sister laughed with someone in the room and said, "I do not know what we would do without Tige," and everyone smiled, and I smiled too, because it sounded like appreciation, but it felt like confirmation. I was useful. That was my place. Useful, reliable, invisible. On the drive home, I did not turn on the radio. I preferred the silence when I needed to think, and that day, I thought about how easy it had been for them to assume I would always be there, how natural it felt to them, how expected. And I asked myself a question I had avoided for years. What happens if I am not? The answer did not come all at once. It came in small decisions. I stopped offering information they did not ask for. I stopped filling gaps in conversations that were not meant to include me. When my mother said, "We are planning something next month," I replied, "That sounds nice," instead of asking for details. When my father said, "Your sister has been very busy," I said, "I hope it is going well," and let the sentence end there. I did not withdraw in anger. I adjusted in clarity. Weeks passed. Then months. The distance changed shape. It was no longer something they created. It was something I maintained. There is a difference between being left out and stepping back. One is passive. The other is deliberate. And I became deliberate. The last time I called them was on a Tuesday afternoon. I remember because my calendar was full and I had a narrow window between meetings, and I dialed out of habit more than intention. My mother answered on the 3rd ring. "Hello," she said, her tone neutral. "Hi Mom, it is me," I said. I just wanted to say hello. There was a brief pause, the kind that stretches just enough to reveal what is not being said. "Everything is fine here," she replied. "We are about to head out." I nodded, even though she could not see me. "Of course," I said. "I will let you go." Another pause. Shorter this time. "Take care, Tige," she said. "You too, Mom." The call ended. I lowered the phone. I looked at the time. 46 seconds. That was the entire conversation. 46 seconds to confirm that nothing had changed. I placed the phone on my desk and turned back to my work, and in that moment, without ceremony, without announcement, I made a decision. I would not call again. Not to test them. Not to prove anything. Simply to see what would happen if the system lost the one piece it had always relied on to keep running smoothly. And then I waited. Not for them. For the pattern to reveal itself completely. I did not mark the day I stopped calling. There was no calendar entry, no quiet ceremony, no final message left unsent. It was simply a line I stepped across without looking back, the kind of decision that feels small in the moment but changes everything that follows. At first, nothing happened. Days moved the way they always had, steady, predictable, filled with work that required my attention and conversations that returned something when I gave them. I noticed it immediately, the difference. When I spoke, people listened. When I asked, they answered. When I showed up, my presence shifted the room in a way I had never experienced before. It was not dramatic. It was consistent. And consistency, I had learned, was what made something real. Weeks passed. Then months. My phone remained quiet in a way it had not been before, not because it had ever been busy with them, but because I was no longer expecting it to be. Expectation changes silence. Without it, silence becomes neutral. It loses its edge. I no longer checked my screen after meetings or glanced at it before bed, wondering if I had missed something. There was nothing to miss. And for the first time, that felt honest. I built my life the way I had always built everything, carefully, with attention to detail, with an understanding that small choices create large outcomes over time. My work expanded. Responsibilities increased. People began to rely on me in ways that were clear, defined, acknowledged. "We need your input on this," a colleague said during a meeting, and I nodded. "I will review it tonight," because I meant it, and because here, when I said I would do something, it mattered. There was no question about my role. No quiet assumption that I would simply exist in the background. I was seen. Not in a dramatic way. In a precise way. The kind that leaves no room for ambiguity. And that precision changed how I saw everything else. There were moments, small ones, when memory tried to pull me backward. A familiar date. A holiday approaching. The instinct to reach out. I would pause, consider it, and then let the moment pass. Not out of spite. Out of clarity. If a connection only exists when one person maintains it, it is not a connection. It is maintenance. And I had stopped maintaining systems that did not sustain me in return. One evening, I was sitting at my desk reviewing a contract when a thought surfaced, quiet but persistent. I could not remember the last time I had heard my mother's voice. Not clearly. Not in a way that felt current. It existed in fragments, in phrases repeated over years, but not in anything recent enough to feel real. I leaned back in my chair and let that realization settle. It did not hurt. It did not surprise me. It simply confirmed what I already knew. Distance, when left uninterrupted, becomes its own form of truth. I stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the city lights stretching in clean lines across the streets below. Everything moved with purpose. Cars stopped when they were supposed to. People crossed when the signal allowed. Systems, functioning as designed. And I thought about the system I had stepped out of, the one that had relied on my quiet participation to continue without adjustment. What happens when a system loses something it assumed would always be there? Not immediately. Not dramatically. But eventually. Small disruptions. Missed expectations. Gaps that begin to show. I turned back to my desk and continued working. Time moved forward the way it always does, without asking if you are ready for what comes next. And then, one morning, it happened. My phone lit up while I was reviewing a report, the screen shifting just enough to pull my attention away for a second. I did not reach for it immediately. I finished the sentence I was reading, made a note in the margin, and then glanced down. A name. One I had not seen in a long time. Not by accident. Not in passing. Direct. Intentional. I looked at it for a moment, not reacting, not rushing, just observing. The pattern had held for years. Silence. Distance. Absence. And now, something new. I let the phone ring once. Twice. 3 times. I picked it up on the 4th, not because I felt urgency, but because I wanted to understand what had changed. "Hello," I said, my voice even, controlled, exactly the way it had always been. There was a brief pause on the other end, shorter than I remembered, tighter. Then my mother spoke. "Tige," she said, and for the first time in years, there was something in her voice I had never heard before. Not authority. Not certainty. Something else. Something careful. "We need to talk." There was a time when those words would have made me stand up, pace the room, replay every possible version of what they might mean, but now I remained exactly where I was, seated, composed, my hand resting lightly against the edge of the desk as if nothing in the world had shifted, even though everything had. "Of course," I said, my tone steady, respectful, the same tone I had always used with her, the same tone she had grown used to hearing from me. "What would you like to talk about, Mom?" There was a pause, not long, but different, the kind of pause that does not come from distraction, but from choosing words carefully. "It is not something I want to discuss over the phone," she replied, her voice quieter than I remembered, not weak, but measured in a way that suggested she no longer assumed control of the conversation. I leaned back slightly in my chair, letting the silence settle between us before responding. "I understand," I said, and I did, but understanding no longer meant agreement. "Then perhaps you can give me a general idea, so I can prepare my schedule accordingly." Another pause. Longer this time. I could almost hear her adjusting her posture on the other end, the way she used to before delivering something important. "It concerns your sister," she said finally, and there it was, exactly where I expected it to be, not me, never me, always routed through someone else, always framed as something larger, something that justified the interruption. "She is going through a difficult situation." I nodded slightly, even though she could not see me. "I am sorry to hear that," I replied, my voice carrying the appropriate level of concern, nothing more, nothing less. "What does she need?" I asked the question directly, because clarity saves time, and time was something I no longer gave freely. My mother hesitated again, and in that hesitation, I heard something unfamiliar, not just caution, but uncertainty, as if she was stepping into a conversation she no longer fully understood. "She needs guidance," she said, choosing the word carefully, as if it would sound less like what it really was. "And support." I let a brief silence pass before answering, not to create tension, but to give her space to hear what she had just said. "There are many qualified professionals who can provide both," I replied calmly. "Has she consulted anyone?" The question shifted the ground slightly, I could feel it, the way the conversation moved from assumption to consideration. "We thought it would be better if she spoke with you first," my mother said, and there it was again, the expectation, still present, but no longer unquestioned. I rested my hand flat on the desk, grounding myself in the moment, not reacting, not rushing, just observing. "I see," I said. "And what specifically would you like me to do?" This time, there was no immediate answer. The silence stretched, not uncomfortably, but honestly, like something was being recalculated in real time. "We would like you to meet with her," she said at last. "To review her situation. To advise her on what steps to take." I closed my eyes briefly, not out of frustration, but to organize the information in a way that made sense. They had not asked how I was. They had not acknowledged the time that had passed. They had not addressed the distance. They had simply stepped back into a role they assumed was still available. "When were you thinking?" I asked, my tone unchanged, because tone is control, and control is clarity. "As soon as possible," she replied. Quickly, and this time, the urgency was unmistakable. "This week, if you can." I opened my eyes and looked at the calendar on my screen, filled with commitments, each one placed there intentionally, each one respected. I did not respond immediately. I let the seconds pass, not to create pressure, but to reflect reality. My time was no longer undefined. It was structured. Valued. Accounted for. "This week is quite full," I said finally, my voice still calm, still respectful. "I would need to understand the scope of the situation before I commit to anything." Another shift. Subtle, but clear. "It is complicated," my mother said, and for the first time, her voice carried something that had never been there before when speaking to me. Not authority. not expectation. A request. Tige, she added, softer now, we really need your help. I let her words settle, not because they were surprising, but because they were new. And new things deserve attention. I did not answer right away. I allowed the silence to exist, to stretch just long enough for both of us to feel it. Because for 29 years, silence had been their answer to me. And now, for the first time, it was mine to give back. I did not rush to fill the silence. I let it exist, steady, deliberate, the same way they had let it exist for years when I had been the one waiting on the other end. I understand that this is important, I said finally, my voice even, composed, but I need clarity before I can decide how to proceed. The words were simple, but they changed the direction of the conversation immediately. There was a shift on her side, subtle but unmistakable, like someone adjusting their footing on unfamiliar ground. What kind of clarity? My mother asked, and for the first time, there was no assumption in her tone, only a question. I glanced at the notes on my desk, not because I needed them, but because structure matters when emotions begin to move. What exactly is the situation? I said, each word measured, what has already been done, and what outcome you are expecting from me. I paused briefly, then added, those details will determine whether I am the right person to help. The line settled. Between us, precise, controlled, leaving no room for the old pattern to reinsert itself. There was a longer pause this time, the kind that does not come from hesitation, but from recalibration. It is financial, she said carefully, as if the word itself required caution. Your sister made some decisions that did not work out the way she expected. I nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. What kind of decisions? I asked, my tone unchanged, because tone is what keeps a conversation from slipping into assumption. Investments, she replied, and the way she said it told me everything she was not saying. I leaned back slightly, letting the chair support my weight as I processed the information. And the current position? I asked. Another pause. There are obligations, she said, choosing the word with care. Deadlines that are approaching. I let a few seconds pass, not to create discomfort, but to give the reality of the situation space to exist. I see, I said. And you would like me to review those obligations and provide a course of action? It was not a question. It was a clarification. Yes, she said quickly, almost relieved to hear it framed that way. Exactly. I looked at the calendar again, not because I needed to check availability, but because it grounded the moment in something real. My time was structured. My decisions were intentional. I will need documentation, I said. Complete records. Account statements. Agreements. Anything relevant to the situation. There was a brief hesitation. We can gather those, she said. That will take some time. I nodded slightly. Then take the time to gather them properly, I replied. Partial information leads to incomplete conclusions. Another silence. Shorter now. More focused. Tige, she said again, and this time there was something beneath the word, something that had not been there before, something closer to recognition than expectation. We did not realize how serious this had become until recently. I did not respond immediately. I let the statement sit, not because I needed to analyze it, but because I understood what it represented. Not an apology. Not yet. But a shift. A small one. Situations rarely become serious overnight, I said calmly. They develop over time. The signs are usually there early. I kept my tone neutral, not accusatory, not sympathetic, just factual. Because facts do not escalate. They clarify. Yes, she said quietly. I suppose they are. The conversation moved differently now. Slower. More deliberate. The way conversations move when both sides understand that the outcome is no longer guaranteed. Send me the documents when they are ready, I continued. I will review them and let you know what I can do. I did not say when. I did not say how. I left space for the reality that had never existed before. That my involvement was no longer assumed. It was conditional. "Thank you, Tige," my mother said, and the words were familiar, but the tone was not. It carried weight. Not obligation. Not routine. Something closer to dependence. I inclined my head slightly, even though she could not see it. "You are welcome, Mom," I replied, because respect is not something I remove. It is something I maintain, even when everything else changes. Another pause followed, softer this time, almost uncertain. "It has been a long time," she said, as if testing the words before committing to them. I did not fill the space for her. I let her continue. "Since we spoke like this." I looked at the phone in my hand, at the reflection of my own expression in the dark screen. Calm. Unchanged. "Yes," I said simply. Because anything more would have required us to step into a conversation we were not having. "Not yet." The line remained quiet for a moment longer, then she said, "We will be in touch soon." I nodded once. "I will expect your message," I replied, precise, controlled, and then I ended the call. I set the phone down carefully, exactly where it had been before, and returned my attention to the work in front of me. Not because the conversation did not matter, but because I understood something now that I had not understood before. They were no longer calling out of habit. They were calling out of need. And need changes everything. They sent the documents 2 days later. Not organized. Not complete. A compressed folder with mismatched file. Names and scattered statements that told fragments of a story instead of the whole thing. I did not open it immediately. I finished what I was doing first, closed the file on my screen, and only then did I turn my attention to theirs. Because priority is not what arrives first. It is what you decide matters. I opened the folder and began reviewing, one file at a time, not rushing, not assuming, just observing. Patterns always reveal themselves if you give them enough space. The numbers did not lie. They never do. Investments placed without structure. Agreements signed without full review. Transfers made based on trust instead of verification. I recognized the behavior immediately. Not because it was unfamiliar, but because I had seen it before in a different form. In smaller decisions. In casual assumptions. In the quiet belief that someone else would manage the consequences. I moved through the files carefully, building a timeline in my mind, connecting actions to outcomes, noting where decisions had shifted from manageable to irreversible. It did not happen all at once. It never does. It was a series of small miscalculations, each one dismissed at the time, each one explained away, until the accumulation became something that could no longer be ignored. I paused on one document, a contract dated several months back, terms outlined in precise language that left very little room for interpretation. I read it twice. Then a third time. Because sometimes the most important details are not hidden. They are simply overlooked. I leaned back slightly and exhaled, not out of frustration, but out of confirmation. The situation was exactly what I expected. Predictable. Preventable. And now, urgent. My phone remained silent while I worked, but I knew it would not stay that way for long. When people wait for something they do not understand, silence becomes pressure. And pressure always leads to contact. It came that evening. A message first. Short. Direct. "Did you have a chance to review everything?" I read it once and set the phone down without responding. Not because I was ignoring it, but because timing matters. Response creates expectation. Delay creates awareness. I returned to the documents, finishing my review, organizing my notes, structuring the information in a way that would make the next conversation efficient. Clear. Controlled. When I finally picked up the phone again, there was a second message. Tige? Just my name. Nothing else. I allowed a few more minutes to pass before replying. "Yes, I have reviewed the materials," I wrote. I will call you shortly. I did not explain further. I did not offer reassurance. I gave them exactly what was necessary. No more. No less. When I called, my mother answered immediately. Not on the third ring. Not after a pause. Immediately. Tige, she said, her voice tight, contained, holding something just beneath the surface. Thank you for getting back to me. I acknowledged it with a simple, of course, Mom. Then I let a brief silence follow. Because the next part matters more when it is not rushed. I have reviewed the documents, I said, my tone steady, measured, and I need to be very clear about the situation. There was no interruption this time. No attempt to guide the conversation. Only listening. The current position is not stable, I continued. There are obligations that have been agreed to under terms that limit flexibility. The options available are narrow, and each one carries consequences. I chose my words carefully, not to soften them, but to ensure they were understood exactly as intended. Can it be fixed? My mother asked quickly, the question coming before I had finished outlining the structure. I paused, not because I needed to think, but because the answer required precision. It can be addressed, I said. But not without cost. Silence followed. Heavier this time. More grounded in reality. What kind of cost? She asked, her voice lower now, more controlled, as if she was preparing herself for something she already suspected. I looked at the notes in front of me, then spoke without hesitation. Financial restructuring. Possible asset liquidation. And a strict adherence to a plan moving forward. I paused briefly, then added, there is no version of this that resolves without change. The line remained quiet. Then, after a moment, she said, your sister was hoping you could handle it. I let the words settle, not because they surprised me, but because they confirmed exactly what I had expected. Handle it. As if it were something external. Something separate from the decisions that created it. I can advise, I said calmly. I can outline the steps required. But I cannot remove the consequences of the choices that were made. There was a shift then. Subtle, but unmistakable. The conversation was no longer about assistance. It was about responsibility. And responsibility, once acknowledged, changes everything. She is very worried, my mother said quietly. I nodded, even though she could not see it. That is understandable, I replied. Situations like this tend to create urgency. I let a brief pause follow, then continued, if she would like to move forward, I will need to speak with her directly. Another silence. Then, softer this time, she will call you. I inclined my head slightly. I will expect her call, I said. And when I ended the conversation, I understood something with complete clarity. They had reached out because they needed a solution. But what they were about to receive was something else entirely. The truth. And the truth does not adjust itself to comfort. Her call came the next morning. Not early. Not late. Precise. Timed in a way that suggested she had rehearsed it. I let it ring once before answering. Not to create distance. To set pace. Hello, I said, my voice steady, neutral, exactly as it had been with my mother. There was a brief pause, shorter than I remembered from her, tighter, controlled. Hi, Tige, my sister said, and the way she said my name told me everything I needed to know. Careful. Measured. Uncertain. I had heard many versions of her voice over the years. Confident. Dismissive. Light. This was not one of them. Hello, I replied, polite, composed. I did not add anything else. Silence followed. Not empty. Waiting. Mom said you reviewed everything, she continued, her tone attempting steadiness but not quite reaching it. Yes, I said. Simple. Direct. No reassurance. No elaboration. Another pause. Longer now. Okay, she said quietly, as if confirming something to herself. So, what do you think? I leaned back slightly in my chair, not because I needed to, but because posture affects tone, and tone defines control. I think the situation is exactly what the documents indicate, I replied. There are obligations that require immediate attention, and the margin for flexibility is limited. I let the words settle before continuing. This is not a scenario that resolves without structured intervention. She exhaled softly, a sound she likely did not intend for me to notice. Right, she said. I figured it was serious. I did not respond to that. Not because I disagreed. Because acknowledgement was not the same as understanding. Walk me through your decisions, I said instead, my voice even. From the beginning. I need to understand the sequence. There was a hesitation, brief but present. It started with an opportunity, she said, and I recognized the phrasing immediately. Not a fact. A framing. Someone I trust introduced it to me. I made a small note on the page in front of me. Trust. External influence. And the terms? I asked. Were they reviewed in full before you agreed? Another pause. Slightly longer. I read them, she said. Not yes. Not no. I let the distinction remain unchallenged for a moment. Reading and reviewing are not the same, I said calmly. What specifically did you verify before signing? The silence that followed was different. Not hesitation. Recognition. I did not verify everything, she admitted, her voice quieter now, less structured. I nodded once, even though she could not see it. That is consistent with what I am seeing, I replied. Not accusatory. Not sympathetic. Just aligned with the data. Look, she said quickly, the pace of her words shifting, I know I made some mistakes, but I need to fix this. That is why I called you. There it was. Direct now. No framing. No softening. I allowed a brief pause before responding. I understand your objective, I said. But the approach matters more than the intention. I kept my tone steady, not raising it, not lowering it, just maintaining control of the space between us. What are my options, she asked, and this time, there was no hesitation. Just urgency. I glanced at the structured notes I had prepared, then answered without deviation. There are 3 viable paths, I said. Each one requires acceptance of the current position as it is, not as it was intended to be. I outlined them clearly. Restructuring. Liquidation. Negotiation under constraint. Each one precise. Each one defined. I did not simplify. I did not soften. I presented them as they were. When I finished, the line remained quiet. Longer than before. Heavier. None of those are easy, she said finally. No, I replied. They are not. Another pause. Then, more quietly, what would you do? I looked at the reflection of my hand resting on the desk, still, composed, exactly where I had placed it at the start of the call. That depends, I said. On whether you are prepared to follow the plan without deviation. Silence again. But this time it was different. Not uncertainty. Consideration. I do not have a choice, she said after a moment. I did not respond immediately. Because that statement was not entirely accurate. There is always a choice. The difference is whether someone is willing to accept the outcome that comes with it. You do, I said calmly. You always do. The question is whether you are willing to accept the result of the one you make. I let the words settle, not as a challenge, but as a clarification. If you want my involvement, I continued, it will be structured. Defined. And conditional. The shift was immediate. I could hear it in her breathing, in the way the silence adjusted. Conditional, she repeated, quieter now. Yes, I said. I will advise. I will outline the steps. But I will not absorb the consequences of decisions I did not make. Another pause. Then, softer than before, okay. I inclined my head slightly. If you are ready to proceed, we will set a time to go through everything in detail, I said. In person. That was intentional. Presence changes dynamics. It removes distance. It reveals what words can hide. In person, she echoed, as if testing the idea. Yes, I said. Clarity requires alignment. The line went quiet for a moment, then she said, I will make it work. I nodded once. Good, I replied. And when the call ended, I remained still for a moment longer, not because I was uncertain, but because I understood something clearly now. This was not about fixing a problem. It was about redefining a relationship. And for the first time, the terms were not theirs to set. The meeting was set for Friday afternoon. 3 o'clock. A time that does not rush the morning and does not forgive the afternoon. I chose the location carefully. Neutral. Quiet. A conference room in my office building with glass walls and a table long enough to create space without creating distance. I arrived 10 minutes early. Not because I was nervous. Because preparation is not about emotion. It is about control. I placed my notes in front of me, aligned the documents, adjusted the chair slightly so it faced the center of the table, not the door. Position matters. It always has. At exactly 3 o'clock, the door opened. My sister stepped in first, her posture composed but tight at the edges, like someone holding a structure together that had already begun to shift. My mother followed, her movements slower than I remembered, more deliberate. My father came last. He paused briefly at the doorway, as if measuring the room before entering it. I stood. Not out of obligation. Out of respect. Good afternoon, I said, my voice calm, even, exactly as it had been on the phone. Thank you for coming. My sister nodded quickly. Thank you for meeting with us, she replied. My mother offered a small smile, the kind that does not reach the eyes but still tries to. It has been a long time, she said. I inclined my head slightly. It has, I answered. Nothing more. We took our seats. The room settled into silence, not uncomfortable, but precise. This was not a family gathering. This was a conversation with structure. I opened the folder in front of me and placed a single document in the center of the table. I am going to walk through the situation step by step, I said. If you have questions, I will address them at the appropriate point. My sister nodded again. Faster this time. My mother folded her hands in her lap. My father remained still, his gaze fixed on the table. I began. Not quickly. Not. Slowly. At the right pace for information to land without distortion. These are the obligations currently in place, I said, sliding one page forward. These are the timelines attached to them. Another page. And these are the points at which intervention is still possible. I paused briefly, letting the structure form in the room. Everything beyond this line, I added, tapping the page lightly, is no longer flexible. No one spoke. Not because they had nothing to say. Because they understood what they were hearing. I continued. There are 3 viable paths, I said, outlining them exactly as I had on the phone. Clear. Defined. Without adjustment. When I finished, I closed the folder gently and rested my hands on the table. That is the full scope, I said. Silence followed. Heavier now. Real. My sister looked down at the documents, then back up at me. Which one would you choose, she asked, her voice steady but quieter than before. I met her gaze directly. Not confrontational. Not distant. Present. The one you are prepared to follow completely, I said. No hesitation. No softening. She held my gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once. Slower this time. Okay, she said. My mother shifted slightly in her chair. Tige, she began, her voice careful, we appreciate everything you have done. I listened. Fully. Without interruption. We know this is not simple, she continued. I inclined my head slightly. It is not, I said. Calm. Direct. My father spoke then. For the first time since entering the room. You have done well, he said, his voice low, measured, as if the words had been waiting for the right moment to exist. I looked at him. Not searching for more. Not expecting it. Just acknowledging what had been said. Thank you, I replied. Because respect is not conditional. It is consistent. The room settled again. But this time it was different. Not silence built on absence. Silence built on recognition. My sister gathered the documents slowly, more carefully than she had handled anything before. I will follow the plan, she said, not looking up. All of it. I nodded once. Then it can be addressed, I replied. Simple. Final. My mother looked at me, her expression softer now, less certain, more aware. We should have reached out sooner, she said quietly. I did not respond immediately. Not because I did not hear her. Because timing matters. I let the words exist in the room before answering. You reached out when you needed to, I said. Calm. Measured. True. There was no accusation in it. No relief either. Just clarity. I stood then, signaling the natural end of the meeting. They followed. Slowly. Thoughtfully. As if each movement carried more weight than before. At the door, my sister paused. Tige, she said, turning slightly toward me. I met her gaze. Yes? She hesitated for a fraction of a second, then said, thank you, for taking this seriously. I held her gaze. Steady. Unchanged. I take my work seriously, I replied. She nodded. This time, without hesitation. They left the room one by one. My father last. He paused again at the doorway, the same way he had when he entered. But this time, he looked directly at me. Not past me. Not through me. At me. Then he nodded once and stepped out. The door closed softly behind them. I remained where I was for a moment, my hand resting lightly on the table, the documents still aligned, the room quiet again. The same room. The same chair. The same table. But nothing in it felt the same. I gathered my things slowly, not because I needed time, but because I understood what had just happened. They came to me because they needed help. But they left with something else. Not forgiveness. Not resolution. Something quieter. Something more exact. They left with the understanding that I had always been capable of standing in that room. They had simply chosen not to see it. And as I turned off the lights and walked out, I realized something that did not require explanation. I had spent years being someone they did not need. Today, I became someone they could not ignore.